Good evening.
Hello. Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome. We're back again. Liquid Antiquarians ride once more. My name's Dave Broom, and I help to fossick around in the more arcane areas of whisky history and spirits history, indeed, with my dear friend, Arthur Motley. Arthur, how are you doing tonight?
Great. A little nervous. I must say, I am. It feels like a big one. It's the big one.
Well, we've said this before, but you've been so tantalizing about this. I mean, we share a lot. We share information, we share postcards, we share theories, etc., etc. This one you've been very coy about, but also super, super excited. So I'm really, really intrigued as to what you're going to be revealing over the next hour or so. And to accompany this, and our great thanks, we're going to be imbibing some Orkney malt from the very wonderful What Whisky. So thank you very much, Mark and Kate, two of our dearest friends, and whose whiskies I love. Always, Mark, Kate. So thank you very much for your kind support for this. Right, so for those of you who are absolutely new to Liquid Antiquarian, just a quick introduction. Myself and Arthur, as I said, we're not professional historians. We are antiquarians. We like old things. We like old artifacts. We like old documents. We like looking at the minutiae and challenging theories and testing ideas out, looking at drink in a new way, and hopefully revealing new elements and new aspects and new angles to the history and the story of alcohol across the ages. So, Arthur, I think once again we're still stuck in the 1820s. so please reveal all.
It's an amazing century, the 19th century. I've got a total crush on the 19th century. And for whiskey, so much happens, and I think I've stumbled across something of significance. Remains to be seen. I can't wait to see what you think of it. I can't wait to see the feedback afterwards. Also, because it all hinges on one document, but also we're going to play out that story. And it really, if you've seen the 1823 Excise Act episode we did, that's a great kind of primer for this, because we were full of admiration for this act, this wonderful piece of legislation, which kind of tied it all up, didn't it, Dave? Where were we in 1823?
Well, 1823, there had been various acts prior to that, and nobody was very happy with them, and things seemed to be sorted, and then there was disagreement and everything. And finally, in comes the 1823 Act. It introduces very strict controls over what a distillery looks like, what the equipment is, what the pipes are, what the fines are going to be if you break the law. Everything, the modern Scotch whisky industry is locked down. And this is the moment that, single malt, for example, begins to be made. This is kind of the starting point of what we understand the Scotch whisky industry to be. And it was fascinating to actually read that act and see to what forensic detail it went into almost to, the color of the paint that should be used on the walls. So yeah, that was it. Boom, 1823, we're off. Other discussions, but the good ship Scotch whisky is sailing on a true course.
Absolutely. And I think I'm going to need to do a little bit of a preamble to warm people up, and also to pass the auntie test, which is my auntie's and my mum, hi mum, watch. And we don't want to leave these people behind. So before I bring in the document that is going to blow a big bloody hole in a few things, I think, let's just give it a little bit of a more focused recap to that in leading up to what we're talking about. So Scotland, before 1823, or really 1816 onwards, you start to see great legislative change that starts to work in a sense. Because you have a problem before that. You have these weird stills in the lowland who are making legal whiskey, but rather very quickly distilled and noxious. It's described as noxious. The alternative to that actually is behind me, the pot still. You can see the pot still there, which that small type of pot still was being used to make a rather delicious, typically malt whiskey, single malt whiskey as we would know it, in the Highlands and Islands and the hidden nooks and glens, but also in the cities as well. So this malt whiskey was delicious, and therefore no one was drinking the illegal spirit. The illicit spirit was also tastier as well. So they had to change that legislation, didn't they, Dave, to make it possible to legally distill malt whiskey in pot stills and pay your tax, basically. And there's a few movements towards that. So there's the Small Stills Act that makes it legal to use effectively small stills. And then there's loads of stuff you mentioned in the 1823 Act, which is kind of shifting the focus slightly from input to output in terms of how you measure tax, but not entirely. And that is crucial later on. But that brilliant 1823 Act produces this, or creates this kind of blueprint for how to build a distillery, and it's effectively a closed system that's much more difficult to cheat. But it is a major problem. It is a major, major problem. And here's a bit of text for you to read. Mr. Cumming Bruce, on you go. He describes the problem.
Previous to 1823, the whole hill country was overrun with smugglers. There was scarcely a family which was not in some way connected with them. The small tenants were not indeed generally smugglers, but the operations of the still were carried on by the cotters, who, in case of detection, had nothing to lose, and they became the best, indeed almost the only purchasers of the inferior sort of barley and big grown among the hills. The tenant looked to them for the means of paying his rent, and the landlord was thus included in the chain of those interested to evade or to violate the law.
So that quite neatly describes how, from top to bottom in Scottish society, illicit distillation was carrying on. It wasn't, we're not talking Al Capone style criminality. It's rather accepted, even though there is violence within the smuggling gangs, etc. But the laird would tolerate it on his land and perhaps even encourage it. In fact, here's one such fancy gent. There you go. You can be Horatio Ross for Aberdeen.
Thank you. What a great name. Illicit distillation was carried on from one end of Scotland to another, not merely in the Highlands, but in the Lowlands also. In the Highlands, I may say, it was the chief occupation of 9 out of 10 of the peasantry. To give the House some idea of the extent to which smuggling was carried on, I may mention that in the course of one day's shooting, I discovered 47 illicit stills. So it's a big problem, and it seems kind of fixed, this wonderful 1823 Act, but there's a problem that's going to come, and it centres around malt and barley. So that's a malting floor where the barley is germinated effectively. So Dave, do you want to give a quick summary of the difference between unmalted barley and barley, how you malt barley? Yeah, malt barley, essentially you're waking the barley up, you're breaking down the cell walls, you're allowing the enzymes to access the starch and to start to the conversion of starch into sugar. And then what you're going to do is dry that malt to arrest that growth, because you're wanting all those sugars to finally be converted in the mash tun. So essentially that's what malting is. It's filling the barley into starting to grow.
And also you get all these flavour benefits further along, these lovely toasty, malty kind of flavours. But malt is taxed. So there is a system of malt drawbacks that exists. So in order to encourage businessmen and farmers to turn legal, they give a malt, the government gives a malt drawback, so a rebate effectively if you make your whiskey entirely from malt whiskey. The goal of this, of course, is to lower the price of this delicious malt whiskey, which is, after all, what the people want, so they can compete with the illicit malt whiskey distillers. And it kind of works. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail of the number of legal distilleries that are founded, how the amount of seizures does start to fall eventually. But a combination of malt drawback, the Small Stills Act, and the Excise Act seems to work. But let's just go just before and see if any of this chimes with how you see the industry up to this point, Dave. I think it probably will. So this is size of stills, interesting, but let's try and ignore this. We've got plenty to get on with. So the two right-hand columns, malt and unmalted grain, bushels of, used at various distilleries. So up in Caithness, in the far north of Scotland, you'd kind of expect that, I think, Dave, all malt. Down in Fife, Fife, using large quantities of unmalted grain. Let's look over in Glasgow. I think this might be a little surprise to you there, Dave. So of those 5 distilleries, three all malt.
All malt, yeah. There we go.
That's
interesting. That is a surprise, yeah.
Yeah. Haddington, we'd expect that. Lowland Distillers. So these are the guys who are now, making grain whiskey relatively cheaply, probably in large quantities. Inverness a bit mixed.
Yeah.
James Harper is Clynelish.
Harper's Clynelish. Yeah.
So he's using a bit of unmalted in there, as is John Fraser. I forget what distillery he's at. So a bit of a mix, and then in the lead up to 1823, I'll be the excise commissioner. You can be Hugh Monroe, who's a Rothschild distiller from Tierninich, I think.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so I'm posh English. Well, I am anyway, but can you state to the committee what proportion of malt you use as compared with raw corn in the manufacture of your spirits?
I use no raw corn.
Your spirit is made from malt alone?
I could not send spirits to Leith and Glasgow market made of malt mixed with raw corn at the price I obtain.
Could you, if you used raw corn along with the malt, manufacture a spirit which could come in competition with the illegally made spirit?
Certainly not.
Would it not be an inferior spirit in point of flavour?
Yes, it would.
In short, would it meet any sale in the country at all?
In my opinion, it would not, according to the taste of the people. The law being so particular as to the fermentation, which they are obliged to adopt, the spirit cannot be so fine.
Can you inform the committee whether the illicit distillers use any raw corn?
They do not.
Okay. So far so expected. This is slightly later now, 1823, but just ahead of the Excise Act taking force. Again, they are, James Harper at Clynelish, using 2 quarters of unmalted grain. Bit weird.
Yeah.
Tainer Hinch, how would you say that, Dave?
Tainer Hinch, yeah.
Okay, good. Pretty much 50-50. That's kind of interesting. And then Ball Blair down there, 176. That's Bal Blair, John Ross and Co. Bal Blair. You may have heard of that. And a Brackler there as well, using all malt. So far, so good.
So far, but that's exactly what you expect.
Few oddities in there, I would argue. Bladnoch. Okay, so it's Lowland Distillery. That's 85 quarters of malted grain and 214 of unmalted. So it's all pretty much as you would expect. And then let's look down in Stirling. So a mix of things going on there in Stirling, which is still below the Highland line, I believe.
Yeah, you're beginning to see those kind of bigger, what became kind of the big grain distilleries getting established there. And the Stirling district was quite big. So I'm not that surprised that there was, 100% malt distilleries. There was that kind of split between it because there was quite a difference in location within Stirlingshire. So.
And then over into Argyll, Tobermory, 22 quarters.
That doesn't surprise me. Those mullachs, they're always like that.
Okay. And Islay, all malted, as we would expect. What happens next, Dave? According to the perceived wisdom of the Scotch whisky industry, or how we write and talk about Scotch whisky.
Well,
I want to check I'm not barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah. No, I mean, essentially what was happening, if you can spin back a tiny little bit, if you look back at some of these earlier reports, you do have some of the distillers, not Monroe, but some of the distillers sort of saying, well, we are using unmalted because it's the only way we can actually compete price-wise with the illicit distillers who are making better quality because they're using 100% malted barley. So therefore, the whole point of the 1823 Act was to allow this wonderful spirit that people wanted to suddenly be produced in a legal fashion and in a controlled fashion. And that is how you begin to see eventually down the line this split between the 100% single malt distilleries that you see in essentially, the Highlands and Islands, a few in the Lowlands, and the grain distilleries, which were going to come along. So that's how the Scotch whisky industry starts, this split between malt and grain.
Okay, hold on then. So this is the document that's got me excited. So this is actually the front sheet of two different reports, but they're very similar but very different at the same time. If I can deal with the right-hand side, so you'll notice both of the reports actually are ordered to be printed by the House of Commons to be printed 7th of March, 1832. And the report on the right is basically a report measuring the malt spirits distilled by each distiller upon which drawback, which I've described, has been claimed. So quite important that they're measuring this. And the period is from the 10th of October, 1827, and it goes on to October, 1830. Okay. Mm-hmm. Over on the left-hand side is the front sheet from a report for the same period, but this time they are measuring corn wash distilled by each distiller and the spirits that they've produced. Okay. And again, exactly the same time frame. So printed on the same date and measuring the same time frame, but measuring something different.
Okay. So the data is different between the two. Yeah.
Say again?
The data will be different. They're examining same distillery, but looking at two different things. Yeah. Fine.
Yeah. Okay, great. Now let's have a look at this is I've had to snip out a lot of these parts from these reports, and this is showing Highland Park and Pulteney Town, or Old Pulteney as you'll know it. Mm-hmm. Barney might be watching. That's his favourite whiskey and a favourite of many of our company. So we've both looked at loads of these reports.
Yeah.
Now I've merged two reports together. So on the top, you've got those malt spirits distilled. And now you've got corn wash spirits distilled at Highland Park and Pulteney.
Oh.
So.
Hang on.
Corn wash. Let's start with that. Let's go back to that. What is corn wash? Now, when I first found this, I thought, oh my God, they're making Scottish bourbon. But it's not that. I remembered that in the 19th century, when they're talking about corn, they're basically talking about, Dave, just checking I've got this right.
They're talking about anything that isn't malted barley, essentially, just a cereal.
A cereal.
It was a catch-all for so it could be, in this case, it could be unmalted barley, it could be rye, it could be oats, might be wheat, unlikely to be wheat, but essentially just non-malted barley would be called corn. So
here's something weird, isn't it, Dave? Highland Park and Old Pulteney, they're making significant quantities of spirits from corn wash. So a mixed Mashbill spirit. Now we're going to come on to this a little bit later, but there'll be a few Irish whiskey fans who automatically will be going, hang on a minute, that's our thing. That's a mixed mash bill, as we would call it, with a proportion of unmalted grain in there. Okay, so that's just one little snippet. Do you want to go on a little tour, Dave?
Please. This is pretty extraordinary.
So I'm highlighting, now we're at just corn wash for a bit, okay? Just corn wash we're looking at. Forget the malt, this is just from there. So I've snipped some things out. So this wouldn't be a surprise to you if I'd shown you this first. Yep. We've got a lot of action from the Haigs and the Steens. They had a bit of a cartel going on, or a monopoly really on making spirit. Huge numbers, loads of corn spirit. Of course, that's not a surprise. Let's go up north to Inverness. Still, Corn Spirits, Balblair. That is Clynelish. It's spelled different, but it's Clynelish. Tierninich. That was Hugh Monroe. He was saying the other day.
I'm so disappointed in Hugh Monroe. He was such an upstanding captain as well. And Brackler as well, you know?
Brackler. Okay, let's carry on.
Jesus.
Corn Wash. I've highlighted some just to speed us up a bit for the famous ones. So Balmenach, shout out to Sandy. George Smith at Droomin. So George Smith, who's George Smith, Dave?
George Smith, the founder of the Glenlivet Distillery, and kind of held up as kind of the poster boy for the 1823 Act. I sincerely hope Alan Winchester's watching this.
Aberlom House, that's a misspelling of Aberlour House. That's Aberlour. James Gordon, Glendronach Distillery, Mortlach, Milton. Actually, that'd be Strathyla. That's the old name for Strathyla. Yep. Milton Duff, Luckwood. That's Linkwood. Strathyla again. Hey.
Yeah.
Oh no, Strathyla Banff.
No, it would be in Banff. There was loads of Milton distilleries actually. To be honest,
okay, we'll skim over that because the next one's Macallan. Cardew, mixed Mashbill spirit at Macallan.
Wow.
I'll carry on. Shall I worry? Campbelltown. Hi Kate. Hi Mark.
Yeah.
Springbanks doesn't exist yet. Glen Scotia doesn't exist yet. But there you go. You've got some great old Campbelltown names there. Long Row, for example. Over onto Isla. Lagavulin 1 and 2. Ardbeg, Lefroy, Beaumont. And I've snipped off Port Ellen, but it's there. Dave, I'm going to put a log on the fire. Tell me about the significance of this.
I mean, the significance of this is that just as we are led to believe that the whole point of the 1823 Act was to liberate the single malt distiller and allow them to trade in an honest way, in a legal way, selling single malt whiskey. What this appears to show is that they've actually reverted to a way of making an inferior spirit, a spirit they themselves were calling inferior just a few years ago, and turning it on its head. I mean, this is genuinely extraordinary, and I would say genuinely shocking, actually.
Do you know? I'm really glad you said that.
It turns things on its head. You know, this idea of what the mixed mash bill was, and nothing against mixed mash bills, but, you know, yeah, it runs counter to everything that's been written about the birth of the modern Scotch whisky industry. Simple as that.
That's what I thought. That's what I thought. And I must say, I've been lying in bed a couple of times and trying to get to sleep and actually got up and gone back down and gone, this cannot be true. But I do believe it is. And there's more weirdness to come about it, actually, Dave.
I'm just keeping a quick eye on comments there, Arthur. And there's Mark Watt. Mark, once again, thanks. And you're not implicated in this at all. He says, this is huge. True. And eye-opening. Yeah, John, it's eye-opening stuff. This is extraordinary. Pray, continue.
Yeah, sure.
We're going to get to, I hope. I really hope we get to Ireland. I hope we get on to Ireland.
Yeah, well, it is very linked to Ireland, and I had hinted at that as well when I told you what I wanted to talk about. But a little bit of due diligence again, because there's a weirdness going on here. And the one thing you haven't actually asked, Dave, is, are they just making corn spirit? The answer to that, I think, is no. For some weird reason, I think they are making both. So I've snipped so again, the two reports, and I've aligned the columns. Okay, so if you look at gallons of malt spirits distilled at the top, and then just carry on down, that's just the other report for corn wash, but they're separated. They're separate documents. Okay. Now remember that they are two different reports printed on the, ordered to be printed by the House of Commons on the same day. So the House of Commons see them as something different, because for a while there, I thought maybe it's just someone measuring the same thing, or two different people measuring the same thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think so.
No.
I think it's the same custom officer. They're not going to send two custom officers to measure two different things. Like, I tried to break this. I tried to think, Arthur, you've got this wrong. You're going to make an arse of yourself. Be careful. But I don't think I have. And you can see that they are quite specifically measuring different things.
Yes. Yeah.
Corn wash turned into spirits and malt spirits. And just to go back to that thing at the start, it's very specific. Return of the quantity of corn wash distilled by each distiller and of spirits produced.
Yeah.
Same period. And a return of the quantity of malt spirits distilled by each distiller upon which drawback was made.
Yeah, because looking at that, you might think, well, they use some unmalted barley, but the overall total is actually the malt rather than this little bit floating around. But that's not the case, because that's not what they were looking for. That's amazing. And hello Tim Pruitt. Look at hello Ian Russell. There's Art Begg. Shaming them.
Well,
so I mean, coming back to that point, is this kind of just a mixed mash bill getting made all the time, or is there some malt getting made and then a mixed mash bill getting made? So kind of two different styles of spirit getting made at the one distillery, or is that almost impossible to ascertain?
I think it must be they are making one thing and then they're making another thing, because otherwise how can you measure them as separate things? I think they're making two different things. So now what I've got for you, and you're probably going to notice an unusual pattern. Stop me when you do. I've got a number of bar graphs, because I feel that this is significant to, well, firstly to a number of whiskey fans. Like, people support whiskey fans like football clubs, and they are our Beg fans or they're Glendronach fans, and this is significant to them. I think it's also possibly significant to brand ambassadors who might have been telling an inaccurate story. Not their fault, because I've never seen any reference to this before. So I'm just going to run through a load of bar graphs because of the distilleries that still exist today. Yeah, so, and you can just pipe in whenever you want. So Aberlour, I'll explain the first one. So I've put all the figures for these individual ones. So left-hand bar, 1828, middle, 1829, right-hand side, 1830. As we go through the different distilleries, you'll notice the scale change a lot. Okay, so some are very small, some are very big. You might want to keep an eye on the numbers. And these are the periods, and it's years ending 1828, year ending 1830. So you'll see in 1828, Aberlour seemed to be making a bit more corn and a bit less malt, and then they tinkered with that later on. So I'll go through a few. Beg, hello Ian Russell. Balblair.
Wow.
Balmenich. Sandy Alexander. Ben Nevis.
Wow.
Bowmore. Brackler.
Yeah, okay.
So Brackler, again, a bit more corn for one of the years.
And it's about 50-50.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
That is weird. And I cannot work it out. And for a while, I was worried that it was just measuring the same thing.
In different ways, yeah.
Or in different reports.
Yeah.
But there are enough significant variances to change that way of thinking. So Brackler, you will see, is not quite 50-50. And if I go back to actual numbers here on our beg, let's look at those gallons of malt distilled. So really close. So let's go do our beg, John McDougall, you naughty fellow. 12,062 gallons of spirit of corn wash and 12,223.
Of malt, yeah.
That suggests to me that for some reason they are trying to make 50% of their volume as mixed mash bill and 50% of their volume as single malt. Why? I don't know, but it has to be to do with tax. And I haven't quite been able to work that out. I think this is going to spark some research for a number of people.
There's a huge number of theories already getting flung onto the comments board. Thank you, guys. Keep them coming, and sincerely hope we'll be able to get them at the end. But yeah, some nice theories in there.
But I'm going to jump to the end. Sunbury in the Lowland. Look at those numbers. 500,000. But significant differences. Okay, so it's not just someone measuring something slightly different. And also, I don't know. I'm not looking at the comments at the moment. To pre-answer some questions. There are distilleries within these two reports who are only making grain whiskey, and they are not making malt whiskey. So I think that is a strong supporter to my argument that what we are looking at here is people making grain whiskey and malt whiskey at the same place.
And just actually, I said we'd answered the questions, but since you've mentioned that, some people are asking about grain whiskey and it going into blends and everything. Yeah, you have to remember, the India's coffee still didn't come in until the 1830s, 1832. 1832 onwards, and we're dealing with a period prior to that, and certainly prior to what we now know as blends. So it wasn't like they were under contract to John Walker because he only just opened his shop, kind of thing. So yeah.
Even then, he's not.
Yeah.
Won't go into that.
Great series, but I'm afraid I wouldn't say they would stand up in court. And this is going to court, for God's sake.
Well, wait till you get to part 2. That's where it gets a bit gnarly. Where did I get to? Cardew?
You just finished. Yeah.
Okay. So Cardew. Hello, Ronnie. Clynelish, or Brora, as we know it. Hi, Chris, and all those folk.
Serge.
Are they going to write this into the history? Serge, are they going to write this into the history of?
I sincerely hope. I hope Joe's watching. Because there's a bit of there's a bit of work that has to be done. Yeah.
Truman. I mean, this is the one that keeps getting me, and you highlighted it before, like George Smith of Glenlivet. I mean, this is the image of the noble barley farmer who was illicitly distilling, but the people just loved that malt whiskey so much. Even George IV, he had to have that malt whiskey that they were making. Yet, the minute they make it possible, or they design the law in order to make their malt whiskey
cheaper,
profitably sellable, and to pay tax,
boom.
No, just make this Mashbill. Fettercairn, Glencadam, Glendronach. And with decline, that's a weird thing. So you see a peak of production across the 3 years in 1829, but then it declines. But the ratios still match. Odd. Glengarry, there you go. There's one. Suddenly, not that much corn.
Yeah. And then it's those ones that kind of back up your case, because you might think it's just a way of reading figures, but when you see things like that suddenly, and the grain distilleries, the large production units in the lowlands.
Lagavulin, first distillery. Lagavulin, second distillery. John Johnson owned 2 at that point. Lefroy, Little Mill. That would be Jane McGregor, our friend from the Hidden Women episode. Big numbers there as well for Little Mill. Lochnagar.
Yeah.
Malt Advocates course. I'll need to change that now. McCallan. What? Mortlach. Sorry, that was a bit quick. But anyway, it's kind of you're getting the pattern now. Yeah. Tobermory, Tullibardine, another big one, Central Belt, and Sunbury I'd shown.
Yeah.
So you're still getting this division of scale, and just to show this division of scale, I've put Sunbury next to Linkwood, and a distillery I know you like, Dave.
Big fan.
Yeah. So again, significant variance, much more corn made than malt. Okay, that supports the argument that there are two different things happening here. And then corn Linkwood, malt Linkwood as well. So you can see that scale, very different in scale.
Yeah.
Dave, do we need a pause? Have a little look at the comments. You talk a wee bit. Multi-Mission is saying their column stills prior to coffee, though. John Lamon's talking about Steen's continuous still 1828. Well, maybe for some of those ones that we've spoken about, I forget where Steen's first still was put in.
It was only installed in a couple of distilleries, and to be honest, it didn't work hugely well. So, I mean, yes, but it still doesn't stack up with the evidence that Arthur has just revealed. The fact that there was a Steen still in 2 or 3 distilleries, 1828, doesn't actually answer what was going on at the single malt distilleries. That the mixed mash bill, which we kind of accepted as being the Irish invented it, is commonplace in Scotland at this particular point. And I suppose that the issue for me is why. The most important question is, why were they doing this? Were they doing this because they'd suddenly seen the light and kind of went, well, hang on a minute, we could do this, and the quality of the spirit is still going to be good because we've got better equipment. We don't have to use 100% malted barley, etc., etc. Was it for that reason that they did it? Or was there something a bit dodgy? Was there something a bit dodgy going on under the surface of this? Because I know, from speaking to Irish distillers, and we are going to be talking about Ireland. I know, you mentioned that the reason that they did it and they kind of perfected it was because they ended up making a really good spirit out of it. So maybe was this just an experimental phase in the 1820s and then on the part of the single malt distillers, or do you think there was something else?
I think the first thing is cheapness. I think they found a way to make whiskey cheaply, and they probably found the most efficient way to make it as cheaply as possible, because it was very expensive to set up a distillery after 1823. You effectively had to build a new distillery with all the locks and all the pipes painted the right color, and you had to pay your license, and you had to have capital, basically. So it's expensive. And I just think if you put aside this idea of the noble malt farmer, barley farmer, wanting to malt whiskey, and this lovely idea that
clinging on to.
Yeah, which it took me a while to jettison it, that you have to think that it was pretty difficult business position to be in. It was very competitive because lots came along at the same time. But very quickly, they were like, well, how do we make good whiskey? And we're not necessarily saying it's bad whiskey, but how do we make good whiskey quickly? And also something funny going on with the tax. And we are going to come later on to something a bit fishy. But I think primarily we need to look at them as people who want to make money. They've invested a lot of capital and they want to invent money. And I have seen records that suggest that they can get higher yield from mixed Mashbill whiskey at this point. And they can make their whiskey cheaper. Yeah.
So there was kind of a commercial, if not commercial imperative, a commercial rationale for perhaps doing this, because I know we covered this in the 1823 one that we did, that the sheer expense of building that distillery was one of the reasons that so many illicit distillers didn't take up legal distilleries, and also so many failed because it was simply so expensive. I mean, George Smith had to be bailed out by the Duke of Gordon effectively because he said he was going to be bankrupted. So
You
Yeah.
love having a little pop at George Smith, don't you? No, I'm joking. We always seem to.
History. I just want to get the history correct rather than the bullshit that's written about him.
Okay. So anyway, hi Shivers. Ben Marnock, I love that point. When did they go back to purely malted barley? This episode was nearly called "When did single malt whiskey distilleries become a thing?" Because I couldn't find one that wasn't making mixed mash bill whiskey between 1828 and 1830. I couldn't find one. So when did they become a thing? And there's a few possibilities before we move on. And I will try and answer that question, by the way, Ben, later on. That's part of my kind of rough agenda. It's possible before they were already doing this, but customs wasn't measuring it, because all our information is coming from customs reports and how they talk about whiskey afterwards. And there's a lot of political reasons, which we'll come on to, why they would say, oh, no, we were only making malt whiskey, brush it under the carpet. So it's very possible they were. And there are much earlier records of oat-based whiskies in Scotland. And there are tantalizing little records from earlier. And it just might be, but because the customs are more interested in the malt because of the malt drawback and because of how they're going to make this decision around 1823, that we're only seeing those measurements. And for some reason, they report on corn wash whiskey, corn spirit whiskey at this point. And we'll come on to what that reason was very soon. Possible fraud. There's another comment there about blending. It's a bit early, honestly, multi-mission. I think it's a bit early to be talking about that, certainly for all these distilleries to be doing it. And Steen Stills, although, yes, they technically exist for some of this period, there's not enough of them. There's simply not enough of them for this to be a factor. And as Mark says, there's none at Ardbeg. So, you ready to continue a bit?
Yeah, I am. I'm loving the comments. I mean, thanks, guys. Keep them coming. But I do love the kind of slight note of despair going. But this cannot be true. Which I'm feeling. I share your pain, folks.
It's funny you should say this, actually, because emotionally I've got over this. But I went through that phase. This kind of phase of denial of. But, you know, these are the founders of our Scotch whisky industry, or single malt whisky industry, I suppose, some very, very famous names. And I was a bit shocked. But ultimately, they're trying to survive. They're trying to found a business at a point. They're trying to survive. And I think that's a probable reason. That's being kind on them. We're now going to come on to some serious accusations of fraud that are coming from Ireland. So, you guys can start. Yeah. Now, this a few people might have heard of this thing, and this is why it's called the Lynx-Eyed Whisky Distillers. And actually, Dave, we're going to bring in a nice sort of our first guest, I guess, because I just felt we needed an Irish voice. There's lots of great comments from Irish MPs, and neither of us want to put on an Irish accent. So briefly, I'm going to bring Connor. Hi, Connor.
Hi, everyone. How you doing, guys?
Good, thank you. Connor is one of my favourite bartenders. One of my favourite bars, Nauticus in Edinburgh. We'll all be going back there soon. It's a great place. And, I won't... you're just here to be a voice, Connor.
Yeah, I'm just here to be angry about all the things you're saying about mixed grain mash bills.
I know. I think what do you think? I mean, you follow the Irish scene a bit more carefully than me. I mean, it's going to be a little bit of surprise. They're going to feel weird about this, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a bit of a mark of national pride, you know, for a lot of people. So, yeah, I think so.
Great. So, get pumped up.
Are you saying one of the positives coming out of this is that the Scots invented single pot still?
All right, I'm out. I'm not hearing this.
Clutching at straws here, man.
Okay, great. So there are a series of angry exchanges in newspapers, and the Irish write effectively. They go to Parliament and write a kind of document of complaint, which is in some places strongly worded. So, Conor, you're up.
Not so, however, in Scotland. The Lynx-Eyed distillers of that country immediately discovered that by means of the malt drawback regulations, they could now defraud the revenue of the greater part of the duty of the malt they used in making raw corn spirit. And accordingly, from the moment that the alteration took place in the law, the proportion of malt appearing by the excise accounts to be used in making raw corn spirits was surprisingly diminished.
Very good. I want a little more anger next time, but you're doing great. You're doing great. So here's another example of some of the anger factor and the scale of it also. So this is a letter from Daniel O'Connell to John Power. It is published in the weekly Waterford Chronicle. Hi, Angus. I saw you watching. You sold me some Waterford this month. In 1831. So actually, we should briefly explain who Daniel O'Connell is. So he is Irish by birth, but he's elected as an MP in London, and he is fighting the cause, arguing the cause for Irish independence. So it's a kind of public kind of letter sent to a newspaper to John Power and published, but obviously making a point. Away you go, Conor.
My dear sir, I had the honour to receive your official communication as chairman of the meeting of the gentlemen concerned in the trade of distillers in Dublin. I beg of you to assure those gentlemen that the prayer of your petition shall have my decided support, observing that I preferred that branch of your demand which relates to the repeal of the drawback on malt in both countries. I deem it right to add that I am unfriendly to the prohibition of any commercial intercourse, and will only adopt that branch of the alternative in the event of the other or more reasonable one being refused. I cannot promise the distillers much of effectual service, but I do promise them the most unremitting attention in my power, and the utmost zeal in endeavouring to destroy that system of fraud which enables the Scotch distillers to undersell in the Irish market the Irish distillers, and that at a price, as it appears, 20% less than the cost of making the spirits in Scotland. I would only request each and every of these gentlemen to lay his hand on his heart and say whether such injustice could be done to Ireland and to her traders if she were under the management of a local and domestic legislature. I anticipate the reply and can only reflect in the bitterness of my soul that, as the woman who sacrifices her honour meets only with the contempt sometimes in her misery, mixed with pity, so the country that has once suffered her legislative independence to be torn from her may receive the lip service of sweet words and hollow professions, but must ever be treated with contemptuous indifference, if not with direct oppression. A parliament in Dublin would annihilate the grievance you complain on in 1 hour, and all shall see what a parliament in London will do. I have the honour to be, my dear sir, your ever faithful and obedient servant, Daniel O'Connell.
So he was known as the Liberator or the Emancipator or both, I believe.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, it gets quite personal. Did your honour feel ripped from the pain?
I felt it, you know. I think this is just after a period that the Irish had kind of a sort of a local parliament, and had been dissolved by some of the wealthy local the landowners and moved back to London, basically. So he was fighting hard to get it brought back to Dublin.
And that 20% undercutting. So these are exports. Scotland to England, Scotland to Ireland, the two blues, Scotland to Ireland in the dark colour, and Ireland to England as well. So, well, something is certainly going on around 1827, 1828, 1829. So I would argue we've got those figures for the end, up to the end of 1828. I'd love to see those figures for the end of 1827. I certainly would. I would also, if we look at now exports from, this is exports from Ireland to Scotland. No, I'm so sorry. I put that the wrong way around. It's correct. Exported to Ireland from Scotland. So this graph will come back, but big figures of mixed Mashbill whiskey being exported to Ireland. We're going to carry on talking about that fraud. But I think the first thing to say, whether or not there has been fraud, I think the Irish were incredibly hard done by the 1823 Act. And if I remember when I was researching the 1823 Act episode, I was surprised, actually. I got halfway through when I was, it says Ireland as well. Because all my research was about Woodbine Parish and people beetling around Scotland and designing a system that kind of suited Scotland. And obviously I've lived here a very long time. Most of my trade is selling Scotch whiskey. And I kind of just missed that actually this malt drawback in particular, you cannot claim it if there's anything other than malt whiskey in that mash bill. And Irish distillers were actually making, I feel, probably a pretty good whiskey with mixed mash bill in big distilleries, well financed, doing a lot better. There wasn't the problem of this terrible, noxious spirit. The legal distillers probably weren't all that bad, I think. Anyway, they were incredibly hard done by. It was all geared towards Scotland, and Ireland was kind of ignored in it. So they've got due cause to be a bit annoyed to begin with. And here is the observations on the malt drawback, again from this 1831 discussion. So I'll just speed on to the last bit. Yet under the new system, if he used 1 bushel of oats with 1,000 bushels of malt, he lost all claim to the drawback. How big is the scale of this drawback? Okay, same report. Gross amount of drawback from 1823 to 1831, £2 million in the 1830s, £43,000 to Ireland. That's significant difference. In a graph, the green line is Ireland, the amount of drawback paid. Look at that spike, 25, 26, 27, 28. So there is a lot of money. Let's look at a few of these comments. George Dawson, he's MP for Harwich. I can't think where that is, but he is Irish. Connor, you're up.
Okay. The Irish distillers had dealt more fairly and honestly with the government than the Scotch, for the Irish had openly told the government that the present system afforded an opportunity of committing fraud, of which all distillers might avail themselves. And indeed, so anxious were they to put down everything that should interfere with the legal trade, that they had entered into a contract amongst themselves to submit to large pecuniary penalty if ever detected in mixing raw grain with the malt. The fact was that the Scotch distiller, having no such scruple, was able to transport his whisky into Ireland and undersell the Irish distiller in his own market, which had naturally given rise to much dissatisfaction.
But it's not just the Irish that are saying things are happening. Alderman Wood, same debate. Had he consulted the returns which had been made, he would have found that the drawback which had been allowed amounted to more than the duty on the whole of the malt made or imported into Scotland. In his opinion, the whole of the malt drawback ought to be taken off. So what effectively he's saying there is, there you go, there's another comment at the bottom there about how little the Irish are getting in drawbacks and how much the Scots are. But also, and there's loads of sums before this, there's loads of arithmetic, but basically the point is, instead of a surplus on tax on malt, there's a deficiency. So what they're saying is Sorry, I see Ian Russell trying to email me because he can't post comments. I'm dying to know what he's going to say. So instead of of all the malt tax that's being taken, there's more being paid out in drawback, according to the Irish, but also according to this Alderman Wood chap. So, we've done that. Francis Baring. Now, he is an MP, Dave.
Yes.
Born in Philadelphia, but has been living in Norfolk for a number of years.
Okay.
This is actually true.
To superior revenue. No, I can't do it. Officers who were sent to Scotland for the purpose of examining the state of the distilleries. They affirmed that every stage of the process was open to fraud. And they noticed the discovery they made in one distillery, which left no doubt that fraud had been committed.
So there's one question there you might ask yourself. Well, why are the Irish not claiming all this drawback? Why don't they also switch to making malt whiskey and claiming this drawback? There's a comment to that. Connor.
A question is often and naturally enough asked by those uninformed on the subject. Why do not the Irish avail themselves of the advantages of this drawback, as well as the Scotch distillers? In the first place, the Irish distillers may fairly protest against an argument which urges them to commit fraud, because the Scotch distillers do so. But waiving this consideration, there are other obstacles arising from the very different manner in which the distillery law is administered in Great Britain and in Ireland by the excise authorities in London. Explanation on this point would, however, be much too voluminous for this paper.
I would interpret that to say why don't we commit malt drawback fraud? Firstly, how dare you suggest that we would do that? That's outrageous for you to suggest that. But also, we can't get away with it because we're being watched too carefully. And you see that a couple of times. So I think the way that the excise enforce distillery laws is actually quite different. And I have seen a number of examples of that. In Ireland, you're talking about armies basically going in to try and break up illicit distilling. Now, okay, there are bands of armed men, but it sounds quite different in the way they treat the Irish when it comes to enforcing of excise laws. And it seems a lot tighter in Ireland than it is in Scotland. And there are a few examples of that. But there are rebuttals. I don't want to just say that. And this is just one of them. Sir George Murray, who's from Perthshire, Dave. How's your Perthshire accent?
Indeed, the evidence of the Irish distillers proved too much, for it went to the extent that every distiller in Scotland committed frauds on the revenue, and that the excise officers were negligent in the discharge of their duty. But in Ireland, the case was quite reversed. There, the distillers were all honest, and the officers all vigilant.
And there are many, many more. And, the malt tax thing, it rumbles on for a period of time, actually. Beyond this period that I will come back to. But in fact, actually, here, this is from 1832, another one for you, Scott, for you, Dave, from the Fife Herald and Kinross, Strathern and Clackmannan Advertiser. But they're actually just repinching something from the Scotsman. Anyway, on you go.
The ministers, however, overborne by mere clamour, gave up the point and suffered the Irish members to wake a new excise law for Scotland. We beg our readers to keep in mind that this is the fact. The law is a law to impose an additional duty of 6p per gallon on malt whisky, an article of which there is none worth naming made in Ireland. The trade in grain whisky has been a bad one for some years, and the Irish distillers have taken it into their heads that the malt drawback affords some sort of illicit advantages, which enable our distillers of grain spirits to undersell them, though the latter have suffered as much as their brethren in Ireland. The excise, the most impartial witnesses in the case, declared the suspicion of the Irish distillers unfounded, but the government still weakly suffers itself to be bullied into the measure. Nay, From the language held at the Treasury, we expect to see malt whisky in Scotland taxed 6 pence more next session to accommodate the Irish. If this is not an insult to Scotland, we know not what deserves the name.
So that's being taxed more, 6 pence. That basically is that saying drawback being taken away or reduced. So that's what they're so angry about. And it rumbles on, well, a long time. And this particular 1831, 1832 debate is particularly heated. There's something strange about it that I also couldn't quite square, in that no one seemed to be referring to these figures of corn wash and malt spirit being made at the same place. And it seemed like they hadn't quite seen that report as well. So one word more on this account, and we have done. No, sorry, wrong one. That's Ireland, actually. On you go, Connor. Away you go, mate.
Okay. One word more on this account, and we have done. We perceive that it professes to give in figures in red ink the average number of bushels of malt used by the public brewers in Scotland during the 7 years immediately preceding the malt drawback. We are extremely curious to know, and with great deference beg to ask the Excise Board where they obtained this information. And our reason for being so anxious on the subject is that when Parliament applied this last session for this very information, the Excise made a return to the House that it could not be given, and that no account had been kept of the quantities used by brewers at that period. Are the figures in red ink imaginary quantities, which the concoctors of the account put down for the edification of the Lords of the Treasury? Or is it, on the other hand, the practice of the excise officers, when called on by Parliament for an account which they do not wish to give, to make a return that they cannot give it? We pause for a reply.
So they seem to be accusing not just the Scottish Distillers, but the Excise Office of obstructing their own inquiries into this, getting pretty close to almost accusing the Excise of being complicit in this. But there is confusion. And one of the elements that is quite confusing, as I say, is how they don't quite seem to recognise this report that I've showed with all the corn wash, which worried me a little, because why aren't they referring to it? So if I just skim down a little bit, of the 254 distillers who work in Scotland, 3 only are in the predicament which the memorialist, that being the Irish, argument supposes. So that's a manufacture of spirits, of malt and grain simultaneously conducted at the same distillery. On to the next paragraph. It may here be observed that of the 254 licensed distillers before enumerated, there are 8 only who in the course of the last year have worked from malt and raw grain. Of this number, 3, as we've already stated, possess distinct establishments. The remaining 5 have variously varied their operations. So very different to what their own reports are saying, and talking as if they hadn't seen those reports. Strange, curious, couldn't square it. Couldn't square it. I'm not saying that is evidence of fraud itself. But one thing did strike me. They are saying, and one of the names signed there was Woodbine Parish, who retired soon after on a huge pension. And these are people who designed legislation really geared towards Scotland, being asked to defend this legislation from the Irish and defend their own work in monitoring it. And there's a lot of nothing to see here. There's no problems. Well, if there were no problems, so this is all discussed, but in the period of 1831, mostly, it's most heated. Here's an act in August 1832, an act to provide for the examination and audit of the customs and excise revenues in Scotland. Not in Ireland, in Scotland. That they do think there's a problem.
Yeah.
All their responses are, there is no problem, there is no problem. And then they immediately decide they need to audit themselves. And around that period, and there could be other factors at play. This is a big graph. Okay, so we'll probably look at this a couple of times. So the pot distilled spirit going from 1827 to 1907, the pot distilled spirit is in green if it's molten grain, and all malt is in orange, I suppose. Okay, and then the patent distilleries. So you can see people are referring to that. These are the dotted lines. So the dark blue is malt and grain, as we would know grain whiskey, and the patent in light blue is all malt, so very, very small. But for the purposes of this, that figure of pot, malt and grain, immediately after they are audited, plummets.
Yes.
And yes, there is reduction of drawback, but the drawback actually doesn't disappear till 54, 55. I think I've got that in a moment. So they're audited, and yes, there are tax changes. So in 1830, the beer tax is abolished and spirits duty raised, and other things could be factor into it. But it started to feel quite close to something of a smoking gun, particularly that audit. And actually, I think that's the end of our little angry Irishman section, Connor. So if you can relax into the background. How do you feel after that? Do you feel angry?
I'll take it out in the comments or something. I'll be here in the background shouting and roaring. But
Connor, angry from Cork. But thank you for lending us your wonderful accent and for your input also as well. Thanks, Connor. See you soon. See you in the pub. We can't answer it. We don't know if there was fraud. To me, it feels like there's something a bit weird and a bit odd and a bit fishy going on. That was my conclusion. But that doesn't mean I'm saying that is Glenlivet or Ardbeg or Macallan. I do believe now that they're making mixed Mashbill whiskey in all these places. I don't necessarily believe that they're defrauding the excise, and that's a reason why they're doing it. It's more likely to be a big distiller. If you're talking about the price being 20% different, right? So that is Scottish whiskey sold in Ireland is 20% cheaper than Irish whiskey. How is that happening? Is it being sold out the back door to brewers? So they're taking the malt, making grain whiskey, not using that malt, and then reselling that malt whiskey there? Or is there some other switcheroo happening, which I think is quite possible, actually? So they are making malt whiskey and they're making grain whiskey. They're claiming all the malt drawback, but then they are, which is for home consumption, but they're actually exporting that and selling the grain whiskey into the Scottish market. And there are reports by Scottish people that the new whiskey, the new legal whiskey, is not as good as the illicit whiskey, measurably poorer. They're just accounts. You don't know. And in my experience of whiskey fans, they always say it was better in the old days. Yeah. That has carried on into the 21st century.
Yeah, I remember kind of looking at old records of like agents in Edinburgh talking about the wild inconsistencies in terms of quality of spirit, and which I always took to mean that the distillers didn't necessarily know what they were doing. They couldn't handle the new kit, and perhaps consistency didn't matter as much in the old days when it was illicit, But yeah, I now begin to wonder whether this inconsistency of spirit might have something more to do with mixed mash bills being made and not being perfected as they were in Ireland. And I think that's the other very salient point. The Irish by that point had already said the way we make our whiskey is with oats and malted barley and unmalted barley. This is our style. Whereas it strikes me in Scotland there's a number of factors perhaps for doing it. Saving money, some people defrauding, etc. But it seems, from this evidence that undoubtedly it happened.
Yeah, but the weird thing is there's this kind of amnesia about it, which might make you suspicious as well. So, as I said, the malt drawback argument rumbles on. This is a statement from the distillers of the west of Scotland. So they're talking about the proposed repeal of the malt drawback in Ireland. So the Irish propose that they should get rid of the malt drawback in Ireland. Okay, which is they're not even making much malt whiskey, but they're like, right, okay, if we get rid of it in here, then they'll have to. Then we can go after Scotland. It's actually quite clever. So anyway, so in arguing against this, they talk about no class of traders in the kingdom have been so harassed by experiments in legislation or subjected to so much loss and inconvenience by repeated alterations to the enactments regulating the process of their manufacture as the Scotch distillers. But then they continue a little bit later. There is a decided predilection for malt spirits of fine quality in Scotland, and the greater part of the inhabitants will not, if they can avoid it, drink spirits manufactured from an admixture of unmalted grain, and that, with a few exceptions, the enactments of the law previous to 1823 restrain the manufacture of such spirits. So it's no newly acquired taste from private families. They like to make malt whiskey, and these distillers, I've not got the names of them there. They are some of the people that are making a mixture of malt. So if you miss this one report, then, and if this report is correct, I need to keep putting a few caveats in there. I'm expecting to be slightly challenged by this. I'm terrified of Ian Russell's email already.
Watching the football thing.
There seems to be this amnesia, and there'll be another reference to this kind of just forgetting, ignoring that they did this, perhaps. When does it change? When does it stop? There was a lovely comment earlier on from someone, I forget his name, talking about, well, when did it stop? Well, here's a key moment. This is an Act of Parliament of 1855, and it also is an act that removes the drawback and changes the taxation level and removes the malt drawback. And at the same point, we won't read it out because it's dreadfully dull, but malt can be made and used free from duty in distilling spirits. So they can put malting floors in at distilleries from 1855.
Significant, you know.
I think it probably was. We've mentioned still types earlier on. So yes, there are lots of different stills, and the date of the license for using those distills, maybe just an eye on the time. But we kind of need to skip on a bit, and I wonder if people like Ian and Alan Winchester or people at Diageo might be able to fill in a few gaps about what happens next. But when does single malt whiskey distilleries become a thing, where they are really only ever, we could be sure, only ever making malt whiskey, and what causes that? And it's a really interesting point because it's a lot later than I thought, and I'm not kind of going to put an exact decade on it, but I think that 55 malting at your own distillery, not having to buy from a maltster, has got to contribute. And I'm going to argue a few other slightly controversial things, maybe if we get time to. But the next period that I want to talk about is skipping on a bit. So this is a report from 1891, 30th of April, 1891. And this is the real start of the what is whiskey debate, which we can talk about our sponsors. It was a complete accident. What is whiskey? What whiskey? What? Yes, exactly. No question mark. So by this point, and up until the end of the 20th century, the blenders have begun to, rise in power. The coffee stills as well as the steam stills, but the coffee stills are starting to produce a relatively, what's the spirit like out of coffee stills, Dave, relative to malt whiskey?
It's higher in strength, it's lighter in character, and actually in those days probably was used unaged in the blends in a lot of cases. So yeah, completely different character.
And it's cheaper. And it's more consistent.
Yeah,
it's more consistent.
It's higher. It's larger volumes. It's cheaper. It's
Yeah. So we start to get into this point where I think the discussion of it starts to really polarize. And yes, I believe malt whiskey had started to find favor. Well, continued to find favor as a self whiskey, and you start seeing distilleries that we assume are making single malt, and they probably are by this point exporting Glenurry, Bowmore, Ardbeg, all these ones. But the blenders, you're starting to see significant businesses. So this is a general view of the warehouses. I think this is relating to Usher, and I'm pretty certain that's Arthur's seat in the background. So that could be Leith.
Does look like it, yeah.
Yeah, from 1890. And in this discussion, and we'll come on to a few of those, and a bit of Campbelltown, there's this full discussion about, well, what are we calling whiskey now? Because we've got these two different types of things coming along. And you start to get these leagues, these trade bodies that are defending one thing or the other. So here's George Cowie of Mortlach. I'll ask the question, you can answer. I'm probably quite posh. The chairman, I believe you are the proprietor of the Mortlach distillery, which is situated in the Glenlivet district.
Yes.
Does Glenlivet come from within the Speyside district?
Yes.
The Mortlach distillery was licensed in the year 1823.
That is so, my lord.
Has it always been a pure malt distillery?
Always pure malt.
You sure, Alexander? Anyway, you represent the North of Scotland Malt Distillers Association.
I do.
So you start to see these trade bodies, but they are also talking about their role as an ingredient within blends, but also potentially selling as a self whiskey, as a single malt as well. And this commission from 1891, so this is Bushmills. Now they are making a malt whiskey, and very proudly so. And this is their advert talking about the House of Commons Committee, which I think is probably 1891, even though it's quite a bit later. And where samples were kind of poured and taken, and people looked at the various spirits and assessed their quality and decided what could and couldn't be called whiskey. And of course, at this point, they do decide that patent spirit or column distilled spirit, or it's sometimes referred to as silent spirit because it has less flavor, that could be a positive word or a negative word, is discussed. And actually one of the triggers for this threat is adulteration, and adulteration with what they call German spirit. You heard it come across that, Dave?
No, I haven't.
Ah, okay. Oh, I think we're probably going to do a full What is Whiskey episode. Mark, Kate, you'll have to... What is whiskey? Anyway, so German spirit is coming over in huge quantities. I'll send you some stuff after this, but it's often actually made in Russia, potentially, and it sounds a lot like vodka. Very, very inert, vegetable-based, often spirit, distilled to very high strength with little or no character. And it's finding its way into blends, possibly through dealers and publicans who are kind of mixing it as they go along. So it's triggered by things like that and this adulteration issue. There's discussion of adulteration of bread, of tea, of all these various things, people mixing stuff with other things. So they're trying to codify and create a law and a quality standard. And part of that discussion is malt whiskey the only type of whiskey? Or can blended whiskey be called whiskey? Can blended whiskey only be called whiskey if it hasn't got any patent spirit, continuous spirit in it? So discussions like that. But it's still happening. So this is from the 1891 report, the different proportions of grain used in whiskey distilleries. This is, those dates don't make sense, do they? Yeah, that card's wrong, but it is 1899. This has come from. So unmalted barley, malted barley, sugar, rice, molasses, jaware. Jaware, Dave?
Jaware. Sorghum.
And then this is the percentage of distilled.
I'm amazed that sorghum was used. I knew about molasses, but I'm amazed that sorghum was used. That's quite extraordinary, really.
This is a percentage of no, it's fine. It's a percentage of distilleries using various mash bills. So what I mean here is 69% of the distilleries, the orange ones, are only using malt. 25% of them are using malt and mixed grain, etc. And then we see the malt grain, grain sugar and molasses, and the rice. So right up to this point, 1891, they are still using some mixed mash bill. And actually, at this point, there are reports of them attempting to imitate the Irish style now.
Well, you see that in Barnard, about, the whole number of distilleries using the Irish style. And, with the rise in the grain distilleries, you can understand there's fewer grain distilleries, but greater mixed mash bills, which essentially is malted, unmalted barley. But, yeah, I mean, there are records of rye getting used and various other things. So yeah, but yeah, it intrigues me, that the Irish really have taken control. And they were kind of the gold standard in terms of whiskey, really. I would still argue at that particular point with a mixed mash bill. So there's no surprise that single pot still was attempted to be made in Scotland at that point. So I think I would say the arguments shifted slightly from what was happening in the late 1820s, early 1830s to what's happening now, which is grain whiskey and also the rise of Irish whiskey and trying to compete with that on equal terms in terms of production.
Yeah, absolutely. It is said that they were making better whiskey, and its popularity in Scotland was rising significantly. So we then also, of course, get another what is whiskey kind of commission debate idea, and that's when it really starts being called that. But it's around this time that you really start seeing people really pushing the idea. End of the 19th century, well, not end of the 19th century. I'm not quite prepared to say I've done enough research to put onto this, but when does it solidify that people really start talking about themselves as malt whiskey? It's a really interesting discussion that probably needs a bit more work. Beautiful letterhead from Moore talking about distilling pure. And then, of course, the Distillers Company, they kind of fight back. Cambus is not a pot still, but a pure patent still Scotch grain whiskey, guaranteed 7 years old. So they are speaking quite firmly about the merits of pot still whiskey, patent still whiskey. So, I mean, if I just go back to this graph, and I'm kind of slightly running out of steam, this has been a big one, but
it's been great. It's fascinating. I loved it.
If we look at the green line there for pot, malt, and grain, so right at the very end of the 20th century, that's where it doesn't pop up on this report. And this is actually this is one report that's published for the 1908 Commission, going all the way back there. And it tells a lot just in one graph, doesn't it, Dave?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And those tiny little spikes in there, conceivably round about the time that they're trying to imitate a single pot still from Ireland. I would cover that. I would say that is probably going to be the case at that point. I'm just kind of looking here. 1879, that kind of, I reckon that is more experimentation going on rather than attempted fraud or whatever. So
something weird is going on in 1878. I need to look into that, actually. Now you look at that graph. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a funny little peak.
Well, but it's a peak that all the classes something.
Yeah, it's all malt disappears and maybe they just return to slightly dodgy practice. Well, not dodgy practices, maybe, but So will anybody notice?
Do you want to try and summarize that up, wrap it all up in a bow while I look at some comments?
The foundations of the single malt world have been rocked tonight my dear friends, by Arthur Motley's Revelations. I think it raises a lot of questions. I think the argument holds true. I think you've discovered something really quite remarkable. I think the rationale on the part of the newly legal distillers needs to be examined if there is any archival records. I suspect there aren't. Why did they do it? Was it to save money? Was it to commit fraud? Was it simply, they had to keep going in those difficult years from becoming legal to becoming commercially established? So, there's that to be considered. But undoubtedly, I think this idea of the seamless move from illicit distillation into legal distillation and the slow but steady rise of single malt whiskey and then into blends, etc., and that this beautiful kind of rising curve of popularity and quality, I think that has been well and truly challenged tonight. So thank you, Arthur, for that, because I've never seen so many comments in all the antiquarians we've done on this, and people throwing in theories, getting involved, and this is exactly what we're at. Right,
I'm really interested to see what the follow-up to this is. I think it challenges quite a lot of brand stories, and I don't mean there's been any kind of cover-up from that kind of side or anything. I just don't think it was understood, and there were just assumptions made. So I can't wait to see what people think about that from various big distilleries and how they respond to it. It'd be really, really interesting. I'm sure there'll be a few brand ambassadors getting in touch. And as you say, lots of lovely comments. Michael Derezinski, really lovely guy. Have you talked to the Irish whiskey historian Fionn O'Connor about this? Yes, we have. We really hope he's going to come on the show soon, because boy, does he know a lot about whiskey and all the history that goes around. I mean, he's actually a historian, something we very much off our cap, and he was tremendously useful as well. If anything, giving me a little bit of confidence, because I needed to know that I wasn't being mad, and I wanted to ask you, Dave, but I kind of can't, because that's what we're supposed to be presenting it to. And I would love if maybe there's some distillery records out there that we just don't know, that people didn't think we'd be interested in. So a few other theories, John.
I would say if they were kind of defrauding the excise, they ain't going to be putting it down.
Well, sorry, you're quite right. Yeah. I think some people, and actually, sorry, there's a nice comment from John. It doesn't have to be mixed mash. It can be distilled separately and blended. That's absolutely true. And Ian Russell did come back. So that's great. But here's the thing. Okay, Dave. So the narrative is that there were these illicit distillers, criminals, but it was kind of it was tolerated in a way. And then they created this wonderful law that allowed them to distill legally and start businesses. Mm-hmm. Why would we be surprised if these ex-criminals then started defrauding the revenue? It wouldn't be an enormous surprise, would it?
No comment. It's a lovely thought, though.
I don't know how many of them were criminals. And in terms of the smuggling also, there's a really hidden group of people that you were the first person to ever highlight them to me, I think, was these people who did the smuggling and these gangs of smugglers. Has anyone ever spoken about where they went? These organized gangs who were transporting things. Where did that criminality go to? Did it go to the cities? Did it go overseas? Or were they finding ways to do a different dodge, to do a different crime, to smuggle in different ways that was not necessarily detected?
Well, that is why people tune in to the Liquid Antiquarian, because it's another area that suddenly opens up, and lo and behold, we're still in the 19th century, folks.
Yeah, I love the 19th century.
It's just utterly extraordinary. Yeah. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for their comments. I can't wait to see what comes back. Dave, we've got another episode on Tuesday, don't we?
We do, yes. So it's slightly lighter-hearted. No evidence of fraud. I'm going to be looking at kind of the imagery which arose around Scotch whisky from all the way through the 19th century into the 20th century, and the way that whisky kind of began to be sentimentalized, and the rise of this thing that I call Scotchland, this kind of mythical country which came up. So there's going to be lots of labels, lots of postcards of ladies looking up men's kilts, and just this idea of how the idea of this thing called Scotland was used and abused in the 19th and 20th centuries. So it'll be fun.
We got a short mention. Just I can't ignore the fact that Francis Cuthbert is in the house, a barley farmer, a distiller,
but not a fraudulent one.
No.
Although again, thank you so much to Mark and Kate for sparing us the whisky, and indeed they are not implicated in any fraudulent activities whatsoever.
I'm just going to shoehorn one last point as well.
Yeah.
Significance. What is traditional? All the Scotch whisky laws are based on what is traditional. Make a mixed mash bill whiskey. Call it whiskey. There you go. At least 3 to 4 years of solid evidence of doing it. Right, that's it. That's my last point. Let's have a drink. I'm so glad I got that off my chest.
Chapeau.
Weighing on me for a long time. Okay. Cheers, Dave. See you Tuesday.
Look forward to it.
Run credits.